Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Veronia, and if you are new here, I talk about things to do with money, your career, and having a positive mindset for success. So as requested, today I'm going to be doing a video on emergency funds. I'm going to be talking about why it's important, how do you build it, and what exactly is an emergency fund. But first, I did want to say a huge thank you because I do now have 100 subscribers. It's made me want to work harder to produce great value for you guys. Once again, thank you so much. And whilst you're there, you may as well give me a thumbs up if you do like this video. So what is an emergency fund and why do people keep talking about it? This is essentially a financial safety net for any mishaps you might have or any unexpected expenses. So a mishap could be that you end up losing your job, and an unexpected expense could be that your boiler or your car breaks down and you really need to fix it quickly. Now, I do think the term is quite interesting because I've always heard about, grandma's rainy day fund, but I never really took it seriously, and I don't think a lot of people did either. And after doing a bit of research, I found that 1 in 10 Brits do not have any savings at all. So that is a big fat zero. And it is so important because you have no idea what's going to happen in the future. We can see that in this pandemic where businesses are becoming bankrupt and people are losing their jobs left, right and center. However, if you did have an emergency fund, that would really cushion that blow. I also consider an emergency fund to be a great buffer that prevents you from getting into debt. So if your car or your boiler did break down and you didn't have any spare money, most people would just use that credit card to pay for that expense. But what usually happens is it comes to the end of the month and they can't actually pay off that credit card either. So they end up going into more debt and trying to just pay the credit card off with their minimum payments, which will probably take years to pay off. An emergency fund would basically prevent that. So now that we know what it is and why we need it, the question becomes how much should be in your emergency fund in the first place? So many financial experts have their own opinions about this, but usually the rule of thumb is you would aim to have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. So as an example, if your expenses are about £2,000 a month, ideally you would have between £6,000 to £12,000 as your emergency fund. But then the other question is, do you go for 3 months or do you go for 6 months? In my opinion, I do think it depends on your personal circumstances and your risk tolerance as well. But I thought I would share a few scenarios with you to maybe help you understand where you should go. But please do know I am not a financial advisor. This has come from my own common sense and my own personal experiences. So if you would like advice, then please do remember to contact a qualified financial advisor. If you're living in a household and there's more than one income, you may want to think about just having 3 months of expenses, because even if one of you lost your job, it's probably unlikely that both of you would lose your job at the same time. But if you're a single person household or you're the only one that brings in income, you might want to consider 6 months worth of expenses. Just because if that person lost their income, then it might be more difficult to cover those expenses whilst they look for other work. I would also take into consideration the nature of your role or the industry that you work in. If you work in a very stable industry or your skills are highly sought after, then 3 months of expenses will probably be fine. But if your industry is less stable and there isn't a lot of demand for your job or your skills, you may want to move towards the 6 months mark. Now, if you're self-employed, I would probably use a similar scenario. If you know you have a lot of projects coming up, then 3 months is probably best for you. But if it does take a while to find those projects or it's difficult to find work, then you would probably consider something longer. Again, you will need to take into consideration your own risk tolerance as well, because you might be in a really stable job but decide that 3 months is not enough and you really want to have 6 months worth. And that is fine. Do whatever makes you feel comfortable. I mean, some people even question whether 3 to 6 months expenses are enough, especially when you look at this pandemic and how many people have lost their job, and also how long it's going to take the economy to recover. So you might actually think that 6 months isn't enough and you actually want 9 months or even a year's worth of expenses. But again, make sure you do something that's right and more comfortable for you. If you want a year of expenses, then have a year. That is why they call it personal finance, because it's personal to you. So when you've decided whether you want 3 or 6 months of expenses or if you want it longer, then you need to decide how you're actually going to build or save for it. Now, I've already mentioned this in a few videos, but the first thing I would do is definitely make a budget. And I'm not saying this just for the sake of saying it. I'm saying it because you need to know how much your expenses actually are. It is not going to work if you think that you don't spend that much money and your expenses are about £1,000 a month, and then once you've done your budget, you realize that it's double that and it's about £2,000. So when you're doing your budget, really make sure that you are accounting for every single expense. But you may not want to include all of your expenses when you're actually building your emergency fund. For me, when I'm building my emergency fund, I think about the core expenses that I will need if I lost my job today. So when I talk about core expenses, I'm talking about 4 major key areas, and that is food, housing, transportation, and clothing. And then on top of that, any bills or minimum payments that I might need to pay for. And the reason why I say that is because if I lost my job, I'm not exactly going to be chilling at PF Chang's or Nando's every single week, because I'm going to be unemployed. I should be using that time to try and save as much money as I can and also be applying for jobs. When you are going through your expenses, I would have 2 separate lists, one which includes what you actually need and the other is basically what you want. It's a nice to have, but you don't need it. As an example, your bare minimum expenses might only be £1,000 a month. So ideally, you would need to save about £3,000 if you're looking for a 3-month emergency fund, or about £6,000 if you're looking for 6 months. Once you've done that, you need to provide a plan on how you're actually going to save for it. Now, my previous video was all about savings, so you can definitely try and use some of the tips from there. But I will say that an emergency fund for most people is a huge chunk of change. You are probably not going to save it within the next 1 to 2 months. It could even take more than a year to save for it. But I do think it's really important that you have a plan, and it should be one of your main priorities. Of course, it is going to be difficult if you do have certain commitments. So for example, if you're living paycheck to paycheck or you have kids, it's going to be a lot harder to save money for anything. You might just have to make certain sacrifices, so you might have to cut out holidays or certain treats like going to the cinema or eating out for a few months. I would really encourage you to prioritize it though, because like we've seen in this pandemic, anything can happen, and it can happen so quickly. Also, if you do have a job and you may be working from home, you have probably saved some money in terms of transport costs and maybe just food in general. Previously, you might have been going to Starbucks in the morning and then going to a food market at lunchtime and then going out to eat for dinner on a working day. So rather than spending that money somewhere else, you could potentially move that into your emergency fund. Even though lockdown is easing, you might decide you don't want to spend as much money as you were before, and you might want to cut down on some of your luxury expenses. I would definitely do that if you can. I do want to give a quick note though, because if you have lost your job already, it is going to be really difficult to try and build that emergency fund. If you are in that situation, rather than building an emergency fund, you really want to look after yourself and your well-being first. So again, you should be focusing on those 4 key areas that I mentioned before you even think about saving anything else. Once you've got those covered, if you do have any other disposable income, then definitely try and save that. You will probably need to make the money that you have stretch for some time, so I would really try and prioritize that first. Also, if you are currently working but you might be in an unstable industry where you think you might be losing your job, I would be trying to build an emergency fund quickly. Even if it's just 1 month's expenses, you know that if you do get made redundant, you at least have something to tide you over for at least a month, which will hopefully help you whilst you are applying for jobs or whilst you might be applying for universal credit, for example. So should you have an emergency fund before paying off your debt? Now, this is a really interesting question, and I do think it does have mixed answers. Again, this will depend on your own personal circumstances and your risk tolerance. Some people say that it's better to have a fully funded emergency fund before you even think about paying off debt, because if you do lose your job, then it means you're less likely to get into even more debt. But then on the other side, it is suggested that you pay your debt first, because saving for an emergency fund could take a while. And if you've been able to pay your debt, then those minimum payments could be used to actually help build that emergency fund. You could also choose to do a hybrid approach. So you might want to save a little bit for an emergency fund and then pay off your debt. And that's exactly what I did. I wanted to build a small emergency fund before I started paying off debt, purely because if something happened, like if my car broke down and I had to fix something really quickly, I could just use that emergency fund to pay that expense off rather than having to go into even more debt. So you might decide maybe to save for 1 month's worth of expenses first and then decide to pay off your debt. Again, it might also depend what the debt actually is. If it's high interest debt, then you might want to prioritize that a bit more first. But if it's low interest debt, like a mortgage, for example, you would probably want to consider having a fully funded emergency fund first before you start paying that off. Like I say, do whatever makes you feel comfortable. You could choose to have the emergency fund first, or pay off the debt first, or have a combination of both of them. Where should you store your emergency fund? Again, this usually has mixed opinions, but what I would say is that it needs to be liquid and accessible. So most people would say that you do need to store it in maybe a savings account so that you're able to pull it out really quickly should you need it. There are some arguments that suggest you actually should invest that emergency fund, and that is mainly because savings accounts these days hardly give any interest at all. But I would say it is quite a controversial topic because investing has risk, and you do have to question whether you want your emergency fund to be part of that risk. For me personally, I have it in an online separate savings account, and that means I can't see it, so I'm less likely likely to spend it. But if I do need to take money out, it does take 1 working day for me to withdraw it. Now, if that's not quick enough for you, there are savings accounts where you can withdraw immediately. Just note that they will probably have a lower interest rate. If you do choose to invest it, I would just say make sure you are aware of the risks, because in investing, although you're probably likely to get a higher return, you could also lose money as well. Now, should you start investing before you actually start building your emergency fund? Again, I think this is a hard one, and it will depend on your risk tolerance and your personal circumstances. So for me personally, I decided to save up for a 3-month emergency fund first, because I was quite worried if I lost my job today and I didn't have an emergency fund, I would essentially have to take money from my investments. So personally, I didn't want to use my investment as an emergency just in case anything happened. But again, you might feel different. If you are working in a really stable industry, or you might even have some side hustles that would tide you over if you lost your job, then you might want to consider investing first, especially because the more time you have in the market, the more you will benefit from compound interest. I will be doing future videos on investing in detail, so make sure you look out for that. You might also want to consider another hybrid approach. You might want to consider putting money into your pension first, so once that's taken out, anything else you can start putting towards your emergency fund, so that you know you have started saving for your future. Again, find out what's best for you and just go with it. I decided to save 3 months worth of expenses, which I've done now, and I'm now moving towards investing. Once I get the hang of that, then I will be putting some more money towards my emergency fund to essentially build that up to 6 months worth of expenses. But before I let you go, I do want to remind you that an emergency fund is for emergencies. Just because there's a store you like that has a sale does not make it an emergency. And a holiday is not an emergency. Planned expenses aren't an emergency too. If you know that your MOT is up on your car, for example, that should not be considered an emergency. You should have already planned for that previously. So if you did like this video, then please do remember to give it a thumbs up. I post every single Friday, so if you are interested, then please do subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next week.